Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college, and I'm pleased to present a virtual Fishbowl discussion today under the umbrella of President Vince Rougeau's series of events that will have us as a college look at what it takes to defend democracy. 2 months ago, just after Russia invaded Ukraine, we invited faculty with expertise on Russia and Eastern Europe to participate in a similar discussion focused around Russia's intentions, public perceptions, possible outcomes, trying to answer the question, even why would Russia be doing this? Today, we're shifting focus to Ukraine itself, on its recent history and its challenges as a functioning democracy, developing a functioning democracy, on the war experience, and what it means for the future of democracy in Ukraine. And I'm interested in the extent to which Ukrainians feel that they're defending not only their nation, but their democracy. In the particular events from military battle to civilian resistance that have made them so successful against pretty incredible odds, I'm interested in their view on how other democracies have stood with them and where they fit in the world. And this discussion, like the last one, is being recorded and will be posted on our website and the college's YouTube channel. As with all in-person campus fishbowls, the first half of this discussion will be primarily a conversation with our fish, so to speak, our panelists who've been invited to join us. And as it develops, we'll invite you in about a half an hour to join in, either by raising your hand virtually or by dropping a question into the chat. First, I want to introduce the four fish who are going to bring their distinctive perspectives and scholarship to start the discussion. And Viktor Lutsyshen first is a junior at Holy Cross, studying political science and economics. Born and raised in Eastern Ukraine, he attended his last 2 years of high school in Ontario, Canada, enrolled in Holy Cross in 2019. His hometown of Kherson, Ukraine, has been occupied by Russian troops since March 2nd, and his family is still there. Markian Dobczansky is a historian of the Soviet Union, of Russian-Ukrainian relations and urbanizations, and an associate at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, an administrative associate of the Shevchenko Scientific Society in the US. He's completing a book titled Between Moscow and Kyiv, The Politics and Culture of Soviet Kharkiv. Markian is the son of a friend of mine, Yuri Dobczansky of the Holy Cross class of 75. You can follow Markian's tweets on the war at the handle @Dobczansky. Nina Barzachka is assistant professor of political science at Holy Cross. Nina was a child in Bulgaria when communism fell, and she specializes in the political parties and electoral systems of Central and Eastern Europe. I've asked her to help give us context about the region and Ukraine's relations with the European Union. And finally, Roman Zaviyskyy is a Ukrainian philosopher and theologian, the president of the Ukrainian branch of the European Society of Catholic Theology. He received degrees from the universities of Lviv and Oxford. He's a former dean at Ukrainian Catholic University, which is where I first met him, and he's currently leading a John Templeton Foundation funded project on science and religion. He's joining us today from Lviv in Ukraine, where it's just after 11 p.m. Before we start that, President Vince Rougeau wants to offer us a word of welcome. So Vince.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to join all of you today as we continue our conversation on the crisis in Ukraine. And I've been heartened by the interest you've shown in these discussions and in our Defending Democracy series that seeks to ascertain how American higher education, and in particular Holy Cross, can best support free expression, foster debate, and further our democratic ideals. So in short, what do we owe the world as remittance for securing a place in it? Before we begin, I'd like to specially thank Viktor Lutsyshen, Holy Cross class of 23, for your participation today. And on behalf of the entire college, Viktor, our entire community, please know that you, your family, and your homeland remain in our thoughts and prayers. So as Tom mentioned, we have an extraordinary group of panelists, so I think I speak for everyone when I say, let's get to it. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Vince. I suppose the place to really start, I think what our audience wants to hear about especially is about the experience of living with and in this war. As I said, Roman's on the ground in Lviv. Viktor's been in regular touch with his family in Kherson. a coastal city which is in the south and has been under heavy Russian assault. Last I heard is under Russian control with boundary lines of contestation close by. So maybe starting with Viktor and then with Roman, we can talk about what's happening there.
Thank you, Professor. Well, as you know, my entire family is in Kherson right now, and I just want to talk about their experience and other people living in Kherson and other occupied cities, because I think it's a very important conversation to have, especially considering that with the unprecedented amount of coverage for other Ukrainian cities, there has been relatively little coverage just for cities that have already been occupied. And obviously, because people are more interested in the military resistance, but resistance comes in many different forms, including civilian resistance. And I think Kherson is a very good example of that. And so just to give you a picture how it all started on Kherson was under assault for a little over a week, and it was fully surrounded until and later fully occupied. And this first week, it's hard to really express in words how I felt when it all happened in my family, but most people had to spend their days in shelters and in bunkers. And my family was lucky to live next to a shelter nearby, so they could just walk there every time there was a need. But a lot of people were forced to move and live in those bunkers, cold bunkers made out of metal, for weeks on end. And it was a really terrifying experience. People couldn't get enough medicine for their family, for the old ones. They couldn't feed their children. They were afraid to go on the street. So obviously it was very, very difficult. But now for almost 2 months, the city has been fully occupied. And I think it's important to see how the lives of people changed. And just to give you, I could talk about this for a long time, but to give you an idea how people live under occupation is girls and women in general are all told to wear clothing that would make them very less noticeable, and advised to stay at home in general. All people are advised to never take their cell phones with them, and if they do, they always have to clear them out because Russian soldiers regularly check people's phones, and if they see anything that has anti-Russian rhetoric or anything else, people might disappear. People even get killed. But in light of this terrible events, I think it's been extremely inspiring to see how, despite all of this, people of Kherson and other occupied cities have persevered over this time. And it's not difficult to see why, because people still need to take care of their loved ones. People still need to make money. People still need to get food. So despite all this, city has returned to some kind of normality, if you could call it that. And people still carry on with their daily lives despite everything that's been happening. And not only that, they've been putting up active resistance. For example, there have been active attempts by the Russian government to create this narrative that people in Kherson want to become a People's Republic of Kherson, similar to what happened to Donetsk and Lugansk. And people in Kherson have been resisting fiercely. Every day there is thousands and thousands of demonstrators on the streets marching with Ukrainian flags, saying that they are Ukraine, Kherson is Ukraine, and that's how it will always be. And it's even more inspiring when you see these videos of people marching in front of soldiers, armed soldiers who shoot them and killed a number of protesters at this moment. And many people and activists have disappeared as well. And I think in light of this perseverance in all these events, it's also very important to talk about something that's very important to a lot of people who live in Eastern Ukraine. And that's the narrative that Putin has manufactured over the past many years, that people who speak Russian are also, by extension, pro-Russian. And this couldn't be further from the case, but this is exactly the narrative that he has used to even invade Ukraine in many ways to liberate Russian-speaking population. So from Putin's perspective and his generals, I'm one of the people who needs to be liberated from the Ukrainian government. And this narrative has been so deep-rooted in the Russian psyche that they clearly expected to go into Kherson, and they thought that people would just give in, and they already wanted to have a Kherson national republic by this time, which obviously hasn't worked out for them. And the way things stand right now is that they have made clear plans to make Kherson into a separatist region like Donetsk and Lugansk. And from May 2nd to May 8th, they're going to completely close off the city for so-called referendum, which will determine the fate of Kherson. And it's very obvious to everyone that referendum will be fully manufactured, and they will attempt to make Kherson into something it's not. And so yeah, it's a very, very difficult time for people. But like I said, even despite all of this, it's truly inspiring to see that people still carry on with their lives. People go out on the streets. People show that Kherson is Ukraine. And many people in Kherson and outside Kherson now call Kherson city hero because of how people show that they will never be silenced, and they're very clear about their national identity and who they are. Thank you.
Thanks. That's both painful and inspiring to hear. Roman, you're in Lviv, so you're in the western part of the country, but also experiencing bombings recently, as I know, from the sky, and certainly at the center of the refugee exodus. What would you add to Viktor's comments?
Well, certainly Lviv as a cultural capital of Ukraine in western part is a lot more safer place than Kherson, let alone Mariupol these days. But in fact, nowadays there is no safe place in Ukraine whatsoever, because you never know where the shelling might start. But certainly Lviv, which is only 70 miles from the border with the European Union, is a safer place. At the before the war and at the start of the war, a lot of embassies from the capital moved their offices from Kyiv to Lviv. But in fact, afterwards they evacuated people to Poland mostly. But these days, a lot of embassies, like the embassy of the Czech Republic and Slovakia, are slowly getting back to the capital, which is a good sign. But as you mentioned a couple of days ago, even here in Lviv, for the first time, we had a heavy bombardment. As usual, with the Russian army, they targeted civilian infrastructure. This time, the car repair garage was bombed, and as a result, 8 people were killed, employees of the garage, and more than 10 injured, including 1 child. But as you mentioned, Lviv is a lot safer place in comparison to the war-zone cities in the eastern Ukraine, most recently Kyiv and Kharkiv, and on the front line between Luhansk and Donetsk, and on the south as Kherson. But according to estimates of United Nations, there is a major refugee crisis in Ukraine. More than 11 million people are now displaced from their homes. 4 million people already left Ukraine, mostly for EU countries. Most of the people are in Poland currently, but there are many other people in neighboring countries, in Slovakia, in Lithuania, in other EU countries like Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, etc. Well, 50% of Ukrainian children are now refugees, and that's a shocking piece of statistics. I just can't imagine what's going to happen in the future, because there are thousands of schools are either destroyed or damaged to the extent that they are not repairable. So this will have an enormous consequences for the future education. But despite this refugee crisis and people fleeing, mostly women and children, from Ukraine, as under the martial law, men aged between 18 and 60 are not allowed to leave the country. But no, I'm not suggesting that they would, because just during this war, a bit less than million men, Ukrainian men, crossed the border and returned from Western European countries back to Ukraine. Mostly those who were working there for jobs and all that kind of thing. So a lot of men, in fact, are returning and signing up in what's called territorial defense forces across the country. And in fact, our son, who who is only 16, without parental control, without parental consent, tried to sign up in territorial defense forces, and we received, as parents, a surprise call informing us about this. Obviously, he was refused, but I don't know how Mr. Putin is going to conquer this country if 16, 17 years kids are trying to sign up and defend their loved ones. It's a great source of inspiration, and our son is not an exception. It's that vision is shared by Ukrainian children and youth as well. So this is basically what I would like to share with you about the situation in Lviv.
So I'm intrigued by that heroism, by that of ordinary people that both you and Victor have alluded to, and a real heroic role to the Ukrainian military. What does it tell you about the influence of successful? Can we talk about successful civilian resistance? It's certainly a time. It's hard to be a pacifist in the face of this. For you, does this undermine the case for nonviolence? Or are there ways that that the activity of people in Ukraine in ordinary circumstances, maybe who are not in the military, makes a powerful case for nonviolence resistance? How do you? Anyone can jump in on that, but how do you think about that?
Well, I guess I'll jump in on this. I mean, I think that a lot of the things that Ukrainian civilians were doing, especially early on in the war, were actually nonviolent. There would be demonstrations in the center of cities, people holding Ukrainian flags saying, "We don't want you here, go home," that sort of thing. And that's really one of the things that was most striking about the earliest days of the war, that people would still be willing to go out into the street with the flag and say, you know, this is our home, why are you here? Nobody invited you. In the most Russian-speaking cities in Ukraine. And so that had its place, and that was certainly inspirational. I think that that's much harder to imagine nowadays, as the war has taken a turn towards being much more brutal than it was in the earliest stages, and with people dispersing these crowds by force. So there is a role, certainly, and Ukrainians have protested in nonviolent ways.
Yeah, let me just add to this. We are still quite fresh, still have fresh memories of what's called the Revolution of Dignity a couple of years ago, and this was the locus for non-violence resistance. And as a Catholic, I can refer to a Catholic social teaching in which we can find both tendencies, like just war theory, going back to Augustine, and very complicated these days, but there is this tendency with the John Paul II and Pope Benedict, and certainly with Pope Francis, to a new trend as the non-violence as the style of politics. And fair enough, both tendencies can find their relative places. But what was done during Solidarity movement in Poland, inspired by John Paul II, and what was done during Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine are both good examples of non-violence resistance. But with this invasion, the threat for territorial integrity and the occupation, of course, people are looking more into a just war theory these days, and fair enough. I can see the reasons for that too.
We alluded a little bit to that historic moment. Maybe I can ask Markian or Nina, whoever is appropriate, or Markian, I'll start maybe. Can you give us a very brief overview of the development of democracy from 1990 to the present? You've been through a few revolutions.
Sure. Yeah. So Ukraine, I think that we have to understand this in several ways. The history of independent Ukraine is the history of a country emerging from an imperial situation within the Soviet Union, in which it was given some attributes of statehood, such as a republic, borders, a national elite, state support for national culture, limited though it might be, to one in which it really is an actor in its own right in the world, right? And that includes not only the establishment of foreign relations with other countries, but creating a political system that it was highly different from the one that it inherited from the Soviet state. So, and that involved the creation of multi-party democracy and a free society, right? Freedom of speech and the civil society. And we really have seen in the last 30 years, dramatic developments on this front. Ukraine has, in terms of a democracy, Ukraine has had some problems. It's been an imperfect democracy, but it has basically been a democracy since the 90s. You have had numerous peaceful transitions of power from one president to the next. You had only one president serve 2 terms consecutively. And you have generally seen a kind of respect for the rules of the game. And there's various ways that political scientists explain this. Some call it pluralism by default, because there are many competing regional interests that sort of no one group can dominate all of the others. But I think that it's also created a situation in which people really do value that they live in a democratic state, and they value their ability to influence what the government is doing. So that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it is that I really think we have to understand this as a situation of one continuous collapse of the Soviet Union. I would say that the Soviet Union didn't finish collapsing in 1991, but rather it's the last 30 years have been a long, agonizing process of Soviet collapse, right? You had the huge economic collapse in the 1990s. You had separatist conflicts in Russia, in Chechnya, that were put down by force, other kinds of separatist movements, which were accommodated in Tatarstan, for example. But you had civil wars in other places, like as in Tajikistan, in which over 200,000 people died in one of the least known conflicts of the 1990s. You also had violence in the Baltics. You had separatist conflicts in Georgia and in Moldova, and in all of those cases, there are things that tie these disparate experiences together, and that's the difficult evolution or emergence from the imperial situation. And the war in Ukraine that Russia is waging is really merely the biggest and most recent example of how the Russian state either encourages conflicts or directly engages in conflicts with its neighbors as it tries to reclaim its domination in what it was its former empire.
I'm aware as you speak about that, certainly even when I was in Lviv, there was a much more tangible sense of the war in Donetsk, Luhansk, in the West, that this is not something that started a couple of months ago, that when I was there, however many years ago that was, I met people who had families serving in the West. This is a long time war. Can anyone speak to that a little bit? Just
let me add a few comments. I think historically this war has to do with the profound question of what you do after empire. There seems to be only two options. After the collapse of the European empires, European monarchies, European nations realized and opted for democracy as the way to go, rule of law, and integration. And the second option that is available is what Russia is stuck with. It's a constant recreation of empire. As Putin is notoriously known for that quote when he addressed the Federation Assembly. He referred to the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And Russia, well, to a certain extent, Belarus, stuck with recreating empire, the USSR with its kleptocracy and corruption. And probably what Putin is afraid of the most is the successful democracy next door. Because if Ukraine, which is drifting apart from its post-communist past, manages to forge itself into a successful democracy, there will be a big question, and there will be a lot of people on the Red Square asking questions. And this is something that Putin is afraid of the most.
I think that's exactly right.
I just wanted to jump in quickly here, since we're talking about the legacy of empires. I think a lot of what is happening in Central and Eastern Europe can be explained through the historical legacies of empires. And I just wanted to highlight to our listeners that the countries of Central and Eastern Europe that are part of the European Union right now, they have different relationships, different position vis-a-vis Russia, precisely because of this different historical legacy. So countries like Poland, for instance, are very, and the Baltics are very concerned about the Russians. They have, whereas in the South, in the Balkans, in Serbia, in Bulgaria, the countries that were part of the Ottoman Empire and that were considered themselves to have been liberated by the Russian Empire, so to speak, there is much more positive opinion towards Russia. And right now, I can tell you, based on my observations of, conversations with people that I know in Bulgaria, on the ground in Bulgaria, that society is very, very polarized. On one hand, you have people who are against the war. I mean, most people are against the war, but you have people who are pro-EU, pro-NATO, very staunchly pro-European, and support Ukraine. And then you also have a large number of our population, which is, for one reason or another, supporting supporting Russia. And I think the part of this has to do with the Russian propaganda and the fact that you have a whole lot of information coming in from Russia. Bulgarians can read Russian, at least, especially people of the older generations can do that. And so Russia wields influence and can wield influence. I could speak specifically for Bulgaria, but I could also talk about other countries later. Bulgaria is a member of the EU, Bulgaria is a member of NATO, and yet it still wants to have a neutral position. And add on top of that, this idea that we were dependent on Russian gas, the energy dependence that applies for both Western and Eastern Europe. I guess the point I want to say is some of those legacies of empires are resonating today. And a lot of the conflict that we see in Central and Eastern Europe can be explained with the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian, the Prussian, the Russian Empire, and then the Ottoman Empire. But I wanted to highlight for our listeners that different countries in Central and Eastern Europe have very different positions against Russia. And some of them view Russia as a threat because of their historical experience, where others view Russia as in a much more benevolent light, as sort of liberators. And so that's a problem, because that's something that the Russian government can exploit and use it to wield influence within the European Union and within NATO potentially. And that's all I'm going to say.
Thanks. We brought up the European Union, and certainly one of the things, there's a question of the EU, Ukraine's membership in the EU and what's kept it out. And I'm trying to hold together a sense that Ukraine has really developed and grown as a democracy, and then also know from hearing people there the struggles ordinary people had with corruption at various levels, and that's ostensibly one of the things that kept Ukraine out of the European Union. Can anybody talk about how those maybe fit together? Because one would seem to work against real democratic unity, but on another hand, it seems like we've got a real strong sense of democratic cohesion going on there.
I think that Ukraine's European aspirations have been long expressed in Ukrainian politics. Joining the EU has always been much more popular in Ukrainian opinion polls than, say, NATO, joining NATO. But recently NATO has caught up in that polling. So that's been one of Ukraine's main foreign policy priorities, is to develop closer relations with the European Union. And I think that the fact that Ukrainians value their democracy and they value Western European living standards, I think both of those things are very, very closely tied together in that equation. And we've seen the EU change its policies towards Ukraine dramatically as well as a result of the war.
Yes, I would like to add to that, so the Copenhagen criteria for membership in the European Union include three components. One is having a functional democracy. The second one is having there are economic criteria, and then the third one has to do with the adoption of the acquis communautaire. But before we get so having a stable democracy, having established a democracy, is only one of many components of becoming a member, and so that's one point that I'd like to make. The other has to do with the fact that even though there are criteria that are supposedly neutral and well established and put in place since 1993, there's a lot of politics that goes behind it, right? So there are a lot of political concerns, and there's a debate whether the criteria are applied fairly to different candidate countries. There's a big debate about that. And the issue, and then there's also the question, there's also the issue of, does the European Union have the capacity to absorb new members, right? And is there the political will for them to do so? And any one country that will join the EU, all other member states have to agree to accept them. And I just wanted to talk a little bit so my point here was that, to summarize, is that establishing democracy is only one of many sets of criteria. It's absolutely necessary. But then there are other considerations that come into place in this process. I just wanted to give a quick update that, we have to separate between the official candidacy status and then applying to become a candidate, and the candidacy status, and then being accepted as a candidate, right? So right now, just very recently, Ukraine finished its so-called EU questionnaire that is used to determine whether a country is ready to join the European Union. And they, so the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, personally delivered it to Zelensky on April 8th. And April 18th, it was announced that Ukraine has completed that questionnaire. And so that is the first step. The Commission has said that they're expected to issue an opinion, not on membership, but on the candidacy status sometime in June. And then we have something that we have to watch out for is the European Council meeting, which is the highest level, the summitry, where the heads of state and heads of government of EU member states meet. And they meet 4 times a year. The next meeting is going to take place on June 23rd and 24th. And then the council has to issue opinion on Ukraine becoming an official candidacy. So those are some things that we need to watch out for. So I wanted to kind of explain a little bit about the process, and then also distinguish about, what are the different conditions to becoming an actual member.
Thanks. I want to be sure to open it up to questions from other people. I'm getting some private chatted to me, some message, so that tells me. So anyone would like to come in and ask a question, I'd welcome you to do that. Maybe I'll shift over one from Maria Rodriguez, the chair of political science. Norway and Finland are successful democracies at the border of Russia. Why is Ukrainian democracy a bigger threat to Russia than Finland and Norway?
Well, I think I can talk about it a little bit. I think it has been Putin's plot for many years now to assert that Ukraine is historically part of Russia, and Ukrainians are what he calls little Russians. And I think it's not a secret that for him strategically, it's very important to have Ukraine as a buffer state against a lot of other NATO states, right? And then we also have a problem that it's very dangerous to have a functional democracy very close to Russia, especially if it becomes more successful, right? Because of a tight grip that Putin has implemented on Russia, it would be very inconvenient for him to see a country with a similar culture and heritage and history that has gone in a very, very different direction. And then we also know his long fear of NATO states in general, and if Ukraine is more Western oriented, then he doesn't have this buffer anymore. And this is also why Donetsk and Lugansk regions are so contested, because they're strategically very important for him to have this line between Russia and NATO states.
That's exactly right. And the thing is that Russians often have trouble seeing Ukrainians as separate from themselves. And so in a Russian political context, seeing Belarus or Ukraine, right, move towards the West, be more democratic, have all of the connections with the outside world in the way that they want, raises the question in Russia, why can't we have that here? So that's what makes Ukraine special in the case of Russian public opinion, as opposed to Finland or even Poland, which Russians think, okay, that's a separate country, that's a different place.
Yeah, I think if I may jump in, all of you probably aware of a special ideology that filled the gap after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the struggle of Russia as a nation state, which is very young, to come up with a compelling national idea. Maybe let me explain this. Maybe we will illustrate this dynamics of how Ukraine fits the whole picture. Putin introduced a holiday which can be called Russia's Independence Day, which is very problematic. It's called National Unity Day that Putin introduced in 2005. And he picked up a historical circumstances around that holiday. And in fact, only 8% of Russians can correctly identify what they are celebrating in that National Unity Day, which is celebrated in November the 4th. Imagine that nowadays Putin gets more than 80% of the support for this war in Ukraine, and almost 90% Russians are in favor of invading other EU countries like Poland or Lithuania, but only 8% can correctly identify what the National Unity Day is all about. And it's the Putin picked up what's called a time of trouble, which is 17th century, when Russia was on the verge of being converted to Catholicism and was conquered by actually someone who lived here not far from Lviv, a nobleman whose name was Stanislav Żołkiewski. He founded a little town just 40 miles from Lviv, and he with his little army went as far as Moscow and conquered it in 1610. And Russia was ruled by a Polish king. And Putin picked up that idea as a National Unity Day, and only 8% of Russians now can identify the holiday. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian Orthodox Church provided the Russian state with the new ideology of the so-called Russian world. Basically, it's a very strange concoction of three elements. It's extreme nationalism, and speaking ecclesiologically, it's ethnophilitism, and the third element I would call it just messianic lunacy, and that's what runs Putin's mind. Somehow he thinks that this world is broken, and he and Patriarch Kirill will bring that world back to perfection. And this ideology of Russian world runs what's behind this war, and Ukraine fits this world as integral part of it, and that's what makes it different from Finland and other Scandinavian countries. They are not part of the Russian world in the strict sense, and Ukraine is integral part of it in that grand narrative that is behind this war in many ways.
So along those lines, when you're talking about Putin, also talks, Father Jim Hayes asks about denazification of Ukraine. Jim asks, what's he talking about? What makes that concept even make sense to people? What's the background of that? Anyone?
I think a big way in which it's a very good rhetoric on Putin's part is that for people in Russia and in Eastern Europe in general, it's the sense of pride that we're the ones who have defeated the Nazis, who defeated Hitler, and you know, the day of victory in Russia, May 9th, has always been the most important holiday in an entire year. And you know, many people, like the current generation, has grown up with the stories of their grandparents and their parents participating in this war and giving up their lives to protect the future of their country. So the word Nazi, it's not meaningless, because for a lot of Russians, that's how they identify a mortal enemy. That's what they think they stand against. So to portray Ukraine as a nation of Nazis, or as how he recently said that Ukrainian culture is in itself Nazism, right? That they're not, that they're one and together. So it's a way for him to portray Ukrainians as the enemy, as someone to be fought against.
It's quite curious, of course, he's trying to
It's
say that Ukrainians are really Russians, they're us. And then at the same time that they're our worst enemy possible that we can imagine.
Yes, and I think just to add to that, what's very important, just recently, Russian state media released a statement about what Russia should do with Ukraine. And I think everybody should read it, and it shows a lot about what Putin wants Russian people to think about Ukraine. And in this article, he outlined that Ukrainianism and Nazism are like, they're connected in a way that you cannot take away Nazism and still remain Ukrainian. What he's basically saying, if you are Ukrainian, you're still contributing to this culture of Nazism in one way or another. And what's really terrifying, he said that on the land that they will be able to occupy and hold, there will be required at least one generation of entire re-education of the society. And I quote, they said, unlike some other nations, Ukraine has proved that it cannot remain a sovereign state the way it has been, and even the name cannot be remained. So it's very clear that he wants to create this connection in the Russian psyche between Nazism and Ukrainianism, and he wants to completely eradicate it.
Thank you.
Well, there are political scientists amongst us, and they can easily confirm the reality on the political spectrum when we compare Russia and Ukraine in terms of what's allegedly is nationalism in Ukraine. Last three elections, parliamentary elections in Ukraine, have clearly demonstrated that none of the far-right nationalist parties on the political spectrum made it into the parliament because we have a 5% threshold for any party to make it into the parliament. And last three elections, all far-right parties failed to meet that threshold. So none of the far-right parties are represented in the parliament, let alone in the government, which is not the case in Russia. Within last 30 years, so-called LDPR, which is, I think, is a wrong name for that party, headed by Zhirinovsky, who died recently. They were always present in Russian Duma, State Duma, in Russian Parliament for the last 30 years, voicing this extremely far-right nationalistic ideas. Zhirinovsky is notoriously known for that. So there is in reality a big difference in between Ukrainian and Russian political spectrum. But as Viktor mentioned, part of it is just propaganda, is it just a series of lies about Ukraine with this regard.
Great, thank you. I'm getting more questions coming in, so I'll try and handle as many as we can and maybe keep some of them short. Professor Carsten Stuber from philosophy asks about the Russian separatist movement and why the Minsk Agreement failed. Is the Minsk Agreement still a way forward?
No, the Minsk Agreement is dead. The Russian invasion has completely changed the calculus of all of Ukrainian politics, and I think there are many reasons why the Minsk Agreement failed, but I don't think it provided a framework for peace that was satisfactory to Ukraine, and it turns out to Russia either, because Russia obviously invading the rest of Ukraine violates the Minsk Agreement. So that framework is off the table at this point.
I see Professor Judith Chubb has her hand up.
I'd just like to follow up on Viktor's comments about the Nazism question.
Sure.
I think this is a case where we really have to trace this back first to World War II and then to 2014. That in 2014, when you had the Maidan uprising and then Yanukovych fled Ukraine, it is true that amongst the protesters, there were some far-right groups who traced their lineage back to Ukrainian nationalists in World War II who were allied with the Nazis. So already in 2014, Putin was depicting what happened in Kiev as a fascist coup d'etat. And yes, it may be true that that wasn't followed through in subsequent elections. But I think there's a grain of truth there that Putin was able to take and then expand this to depicting the entire Ukrainian population as being under the sway of these far right-wing, in his view, neo-Nazi nationalists. So when you then look at Russian public opinion, it's striking through his control of the media, the extent to which he's been able to take that small grain of truth about what happened in 2014 and apparently quite successfully convince the Russian population that they are in fact fighting the same existential battle against Nazism in Ukraine that they were fighting against the Nazis in World War II. I think one of the most indicative things that I read recently was that apparently Putin's objective is to complete the conquest of Ukraine by May the 9th, which is the celebration of Victory Day. So that's become the major holiday in Russia with major celebrations in Red Square. The triumphant victory of Russia over the Nazis, and Ukraine has become part of this narrative. But to argue that what's happening in Ukraine is part of May 9th, Victory in Europe Day, you have to understand that there are roots of extremist Ukrainian nationalism, which historically were tied to the Nazis. And Putin's been able to exploit that and apparently quite effectively convince Russian public opinion that the entire Ukrainian population has come under the sway of these neo-Nazi nationalists.
Yes, and just to add to that again, in the recent article the Russian state media released, that's exactly what they were trying to insinuate. They were saying that even if the general population, not necessarily fascists, but they're all in one way or another are contributing to the fascist regime. So, and therefore they have to be fully re-educated. So in a sense, he's just equating being Ukrainian with being a fascist, which is especially like a cruel joke when you realize that it's not just Russia who fought Nazi Germany, right? Ukraine was as much a big part of it as Russia was. So it's, yeah, it is especially frightening in what way Russia is trying to portray Ukraine right now. And it is also very impressive considering that unlike some other countries like China, in Russia, people still have access to free internet and any media, but Putin's propaganda has been able to convince the majority of the population of this false statements.
I want to move from the fascism question unless Nina or Markian have something very quick or urgent about that.
I do have a point about that. I mean, I just think that we have to be really careful not to explain the effectiveness of Putin's propaganda and make it plausible in some way, because the signifier of Nazis in Russian political culture is extremely emotional and extremely powerful. And yes, that is true. But when you have a signifier that's completely divorced from the signified, in the case of Ukraine, you have to really be careful to ensure that you're always distancing yourself from that rhetoric, which is just to be frank, it's propaganda and it's based on lies.
Nina, do you have a quick point to that question, or is there something else?
Yes, I'd like to point out some of the irony in the fact that Putin and his Russia has allied with far-right leaders in Western Europe. For example, the Austrian FPO, the Austrian Freedom Party, in 2016 signed an agreement with United Russia. Just last night, there was the French presidential debate, and Marine Le Pen, the far-right candidate, her party had taken out a loan from the first Czech Russian bank, and a loan that she admits that they're still paying. So on one hand, we have that rhetoric that the Russian government is using, but on the other hand, the Russian government is establishing connections and economic interests around the Russian government are establishing connections with far-right parties in Western Europe that could potentially undermine democracy in Western Europe. I think Professor Carey asked a question in the chat about France and the challenge to democracy. And I think what's going to happen in France on Sunday is really, really important. And I think it could have big implications on NATO unity, on EU unity, because Marine Le Pen is, the election is very close between Macron and Le Pen. And why is that a problem? I mean, it's a huge problem because Marine Le Pen, even though she has tried to scrub her image a little bit and distance herself from the fact that she has had good relationship with Putin. There was a leaflet distributed in France where, she was planning on distributing in France of her and Putin together from her previous visit. And then they scrapped all that and just tried to, not draw attention to that. She has softened her image. She has said in the past that she would pull France out of the EU, maybe. But on the other hand, now she doesn't talk about that anymore. Now she says, no, France is going to stay in the EU. But in the past, she has also said, that France should leave NATO, right? So my concern is that there are ways in which far-right candidates in Western Europe and in Central and Eastern Europe, with support from Russia, could undermine the major European and Western institutions from within. And so we need to be aware of that. In addition to that, the French president is extremely powerful, not as powerful as the Russian president, but the French president, for instance, can dissolve the National Assembly, et cetera, et cetera. So there's, if Marine Le Pen wins, she's gonna wield a tremendous amount of power, which comes with the position of the presidency. There are almost no checks and balances on the French president. And France is a key player in both EU and NATO. And so, and it's not a coincidence that Navalny had even I think yesterday it was in the news that he had spoken, had made a statement to the French people, to think about the consequences of their choice. So it's, personally, I'm very worried about what's happening in Ukraine, and frankly, I'm heartbroken. I am also very worried about the quality of democracy in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. I'm not saying that Russia is the only reason why we see democratic backsliding. I think there are lots of other reasons for democratic backsliding inside, happening on the inside. But we do know, we have seen that Russia has tried to influence, and a lot of this influence comes from, from the media and the social media. And my question, my experience, at least with Bulgaria, is that it's much easier to find news sources from Russian sources for free on the internet instead of But if you want to read the New York Times, or if you want to read the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, there's a paywall, right? So there is this question of like this information war. And I just wanted to point out that, you know, personally, I'm very worried about the quality of democracy, not just in Ukraine, not just in in Eastern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe, but also in Western Europe.
Thank you. Roman, I want to ask you a question because you referred to Patriarch Kirill, and on the last session we did, there were questions about the degree to which this has been a spiritual battle, and or at least framed that way. And part of this is the Ukrainian Orthodox churches moved to autocephaly, the way that the Russian church is using it. How do you see, can you say a little bit about that, this as a spiritual battle, and what is happening to religious unity, the Orthodox Church, Catholic relations, whatever piece you want to pick up in Ukraine itself?
Well, it's a very complex question, of course. Let me just comment on a couple of aspects. First of all, the religious landscape in Ukraine is very different from both neighbors, Russia and, for instance, Poland. Unlike Russia, that is almost completely an Orthodox country with the monopoly of the Russian Orthodox Church in religious life, and plus the historical sort of subservient position of the Russian Church for the state. The Russian Church never had a chance to exist in even semi-democratic circumstances. Ukraine, in contrast, has always been not only multi-confessional country, but multi-religious country, with the enjoying religious freedom. And even neighboring Poland, which is predominantly a Catholic country, is as monolithic as Russia is Orthodox. So Ukraine was different from their neighbors for centuries. And as you mentioned, there was this historical drive towards autocephaly. Ukraine still is a predominantly Orthodox country, but there is a geographical nuances to that. East of Ukraine is mostly Orthodox, but Western Ukraine, which historically been part of Austrian Empire, is predominantly Catholic, both Latin Rite and Byzantine Rite Catholic. But the major role is played on the religious landscape by what's called All Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations. It's a body that unites faith-based communities across the country, and they have a presidency going in turns, and they represent religious communities for the government, and they lobby a lot of things, and there is a lot of ecumenical and interreligious activities going on there in a spirit of respect, mutual understanding, and ecumenical rapprochement. But as you mentioned, one thing that upset Russia and Russian Orthodox Church was this move towards autocephaly, which is within global Orthodoxy is a normal way of doing things. Like there are national churches like Orthodox churches in Bulgaria that had a very hard time to get it historically, and many other Central and Eastern European countries. So Ukraine finally got its tomos of autocephaly from its mother church, the Patriarchate of Constantinople, and that, as you know, created a crisis within global orthodoxy, and even the break of Eucharistic intercommunion between Patriarchate of Constantinople and the Patriarchate of Moscow, which is still in place nowadays. So it's part of the story, we
So was
know
the-
that.
For those not familiar with it, it was a sort of a religious independence, if you will, from Moscow, that Moscow perceived as one more step away from being part of Russia, and therefore as a threat. And it was a threat to Kirill the Patriarch, but also to Putin. But
Yes, but it's even more complicated than that, because there is still a branch of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, known as the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. Part of those communities drifted apart and joined the newly established Orthodox Church of Ukraine. But the Orthodox Church of Ukraine was created on the basis of what's before was known as the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Kiev Patriarchate and Autocephalous Orthodox Church, two ecclesial bodies that were not recognized by any other global Orthodox churches, but now they are, and that's a major threat to Russian Orthodoxy, not only because of the losing so many communities, but also losing its historical cradle, because Kiev was baptized in late 10th century during the reign of Prince Volodymyr, and Kievan Christianity then spread to Muscovy. Moscow was historically a daughter church of the Kiev, which politically later became framed imperially more powerful than the mother church. But now, in a way, historical justice is done, and Kiev is independent and became a part of the larger family of autocephalous Orthodox churches within global Orthodoxy. And that's also is often mentioned as another threat to what's called Russian world. But as I said, religious landscape in Ukraine enjoys a lot of religious freedom, and ecumenical relations and interreligious dialogue is as successful as it is in the West.
thank you. I want to just turn in the few moments we have left, and we've gone a little bit over, so thanks for your patience if you're still here with us. But looking toward the future, one of the questions Professor Cynthia Hooper asked, and I take it that she means if this is successful, that Ukraine is successful in the war. But she says, last night I was thinking about the Yugoslav wars and remembering that in 2019, I was in Croatia, and in some ways it was amazing to see Croats, Serbs, and Bosnians interacting without hate, even after all the past atrocities. Can you panelists see a time in the future when Ukrainians will not hate Russians for what is happening there today? And I'll add for others, of course, as Cynthia Hooper knows, that that line, Ukrainians hating Russians, I mean, that these are Russian speakers, that I hear enough stories about people whose mother-in-law is Russian, and so those boundaries aren't often as clear in families. This divides up families. Can you talk about what that's done and what you see for the future? Or is the break sort of inseparable now? Markian?
So I want to sort of slyly answer this question by saying that there are many ethnic Russians who live in Ukraine, and there are many Russian speakers in Ukraine. And I don't see any problems with Ukrainians and Russians in Ukraine interacting peacefully. I think the difference comes when you think about state allegiance, and with Russians from Russia who have, by all appearances, wholeheartedly supported the war. I think that's going to be an extremely difficult bone of contention for many Ukrainians in the future, regardless of what their specific ethnic background is.
I think that is true, and that's something I think about a lot because among other things that are truly terrifying about this war, one thing that really scared me is, seeing social media of people in Kherson and being in many chats and just communicating with people. There is clear hatred towards not just Russia, but as was said, people who support Russia and support Russian actions and see Ukraine as not being independent. And of course, a case could be made that in many ways, this is the result of propaganda, but for many Ukrainian people, this doesn't really matter. And there is definitely high level of animosity between the two nations now. And it's truly difficult to see how it can get better. I hope it does, though.
I think we can learn a lot from the experience of the post-World War II reconciliation in Europe between France and Germany, and then between Germany and Poland, and the role of the Catholic Church and the hierarchy that was played in those processes of reconciliation. I think the church will, Ukrainian churches will play a major role in the future, but it's important to have the process, what's called the purification of memories, and reconciliation is not an amnesia. So the aggressors and the victims should be called by their names, and then truth should be established, and justice brought about. So there is a whole chain of events and processes that needs to take place for the successful reconciliation. And of course, Ukrainians are well aware that Russia is not going to become, part of New Zealand. It's always will be there, and somehow we'll have to look for ways to coexist. But at this stage of the brutal war and invasion and death and suffering brought by the Putinist regime, it's of course impossible. But we'll have to look for ways in the future. And by the way, I think there is a lot of talk these days about what might come out of the peace talks between Russian and Ukrainian delegation, and the prospects of the possible meeting between President Zelensky and President Putin. But I think there is nothing that can come out of this, because Putin comes to these peace talks with his agenda, where the main point is a capitulation of Ukraine. And on the Ukrainian side, there is nothing that we can find compromise with. But what the best solution in terms of the security for the future of Ukraine is democratic Russia. And I believe that ordinary Russians deserve democracy. And if I may give you an example, after World War II, there hasn't been a case, not a single one, that one democracy invaded another. So the best security guarantee after the failure of Budapest Memorandum and many other treaties that guaranteed territorial integrity and security for Ukraine is probably not even NATO, but democratic Russia, because that's the best solution for European continent and for the future of both Ukraine and Russia. But that involves the collapse of the Putinist regime. And the sooner, the better, of course.
I think I wholeheartedly agree with that, especially that democratic Russia is definitely a better guarantee for Ukraine than even NATO member states, because I think in this war, what we all found out is that no matter the cause, NATO member states aren't going to be willing to engage in an open confrontation with Russia. And even though it was expected, but I think it's also very important, and I'm worried about its implications, both as Ukrainian citizen and a student of international relations, because for one, even if this war ends, we clearly saw that NATO is not going to be willing to help beyond economic sanctions or helping with weapons and so on. So if, let's say, one day Russia emerges stronger than it is now and decides to take over Ukraine again, there will be no one to stop it. And second implication is that of future international conflict. And I often think about it, that does the fact that NATO isn't going to be willing to engage any nuclear states mean that in the future we're going to have a few nuclear states who cannot be challenged in any ways other than economics? And does it mean that the future of international conflict will be full of big states like Russia, India, US, who have nuclear arsenal, and the smaller states will have significantly less power than than they do now?
So I just want to give everyone maybe a 1-minute wrap-up statement, what you want to leave us all with here that's most important. Markian, if I started with you then?
Sure. So I guess just to finish out this thought about the ethnic hatred, I think that it's really, really crucial to understand that this war is not about ethnic hatred. And I think that Ukrainians did not spend all their time suppressing their Russian-speaking compatriots or ethnic Russians or Jews or Muslims or Tatars or anybody who's in their country. This is the Russian narrative, that Ukraine was a Nazi country that was repressing its minority populations, and there's just no basis for that statement whatsoever. This is really about values, and this is a conflict in which a democratic state with a long and painful history of totalitarianism, led by a Jewish president from a Russian-speaking area who grew up speaking Russian, was elected with 73% of the vote in the last presidential election. So how anyone can take seriously the idea that Ukraine is a Nazi country is just beyond me. And we have to be very clear about that. And what happened is that this country was invaded by a much larger neighbor with an autocratic political system dominated by oligarchic interests and with a messianic nationalist ideology aimed at destroying the Ukrainian state and reintegrating Ukrainians into the great Russian people, of which Russians think they're already a part. So I think we have to be pretty clear that and careful in how we understand this war. And it's about values, not about ethnicity.
Thanks. Nina?
So my conclusion is, I think we all have touched upon this issue, is like the value of democracy. And I think the West, the US, Western Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, all the countries that are part of NATO and the European Union, there have been instances and experiences with democratic backsliding, and that is very problematic. And citizens in those countries need to kind of realize the implications of that democratic backsliding, because I believe that that could have important consequences on not just on what happens within those countries, but also what happens with the international order, what happens with the institutions such as the European Union and NATO and this entire international order that is being created since World War II.
Rowan?
Let me finish with the three ideas. The first one is here in Central and Eastern Europe, a lot of people were disillusioned by the idea that capitalism brings about democracy automatically, which is completely wrong. It's wrong in Ukraine. It's wrong in Russia. We see this kleptocracy where 500 literary men owns more than 60% of Russian national wealth, and all that is abroad. And this 500 men are wealthier than 99.8% of the rest of the population of Russia, enjoying life, luxurious yachts and apartments and mansions in the West, educating their children at Harvard and Oxford, and spending holidays in French Riviera. And it's also not the case in China, as we can see. Another lesson that probably Western countries have to learn is that there is no just natural resources from Russia. There is no gas unless it's weaponized. There is no oil unless it's militarized for political purposes. And we are witnessing that. And probably the third point that and what Ukraine desperately needs is that the Western countries should not get away with the war crimes that he is committing in Ukraine through the Russian army. And in fact, I'm speaking from Lviv, and this might come as a surprise that both terms, crime against humanity, as well as the genocide in a juridical sense, were for the first time ever forged by two Jewish lawyers that both studied here in Lviv at the Lviv University, just across the street from here where I'm talking to you. One ended up being the judge of International Criminal Court in Britain, and one ended up in the US, and they are instrumental in introduction, both these terms, crime against humanity and genocide, in the system of international law. So we have to hold Putin accountable for all these war crimes, and don't let him get away with this.
Thank you. Viktor.
Yes, I would just like to echo again the argument that unlike what Russia would have others think, the conflict has never been and is not about ethnic conflict. But I would also like to put it from a personal perspective, because me growing up in Kherson, I have spoken Russian language my entire life. My family speaks Russian, and I speak Russian with my friends, and I have a lot of Russian friends, and so do a lot of my friends. So it has never been a question of that. And until 2014, I was obviously a little boy, but I wasn't even aware about this notion of any kind of conflict or hatred or between Ukrainians or hatred for Russian language. It's simply just manufactured, and it doesn't exist. And similarly to what Professor Markian said, it just doesn't fail to baffle me to what extent this has been blown off, that even in Western media, we see some people actually promoting this narrative and this argument that I've seen on Fox News and some other outlets, people entertaining this argument as if it could actually be true, which couldn't be further from the truth.
Thank you. Thank you to the four of you, Markian, Nina, Roman, Viktor, for some really insightful comments, and thank you to the questioners. I'll apologize to those who private chatted me or added questions otherwise that we didn't get to go to those, but I think this really helps us get a richer sense of Ukraine and its situation, and so I'm grateful to all of you. Thanks very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.